Many of U.S. President Donald Trump's political enemies have been targeted by the Justice Department. The New York Attorney General Letitia James, Senator Adam Schiff, former FBI Director James Comey, and now Jerome Powell, the chairman of the Federal Reserve, is being investigated. Federal prosecutors allege Powell lied to Congress about the cost of renovating the headquarters of the Fed. CGTN's Owen Fairclough joins us now from the newsroom. Owen, Jerome Powell has been criticized by the president before. He's taken much of that criticism in his stride, but now he's being investigated. How is he responding to that?
Anand, it's hard to know, isn't it, which is the bigger bombshell, a criminal investigation into a sitting central bank chair. This doesn't happen in modern central banking. It's supposed to be the rarefied, consensual, even collegiate world, orderly policymaking to direct monetary policy. Or is the bigger bombshell Jerome Powell taking to the airwaves via the US Federal Reserve to defend those allegations and suggest that the Trump administration is trying to coerce him into directing monetary policy for its political gains? Let's hear from Jerome Powell.
The threat of criminal charges is a consequence of the Federal Reserve setting interest rates based on our best assessment of what will serve the public, rather than following the preferences of the president. This is about whether the Fed will be able to continue to set interest rates based on evidence and economic conditions, or whether instead monetary policy will be directed by political pressure or intimidation.
Anand, you mentioned Powell has been weathering attacks from US President Donald Trump. This was truly the moment the gloves came off for Powell. He's been under attack by Trump over the last year or so, which is ironic in some ways because you'll remember Donald Trump appointed Powell when Trump was during Trump's first term. You can see the pair of them there at the US Federal Reserve. And this is at the center of these allegations. Republicans suggesting there's been fraud and mismanagement, both in the budgeting and the scope and scale of the renovations of the Fed building here in Washington, D.C. This dates back to testimony that Powell gave in the summer. So in hindsight, in some ways, we saw this coming, but it's shocked financial markets across the world this weekend. It's ironic in some ways. Powell has been under pressure to cut the main interest rate that influences a lot of economic activity, the cost of mortgages, how much businesses need to spend to invest, and so on. And ironically, Powell had been bringing that interest rate down gradually, but decided to hold off essentially at cutting any more for the foreseeable future, concerned that cutting that rate anymore might drive up lingering inflation. The White House and Donald Trump disagreed. They think that rate can go down more. And that's what partly led to these increasingly personal attacks and even threats to fire Powell before his term ends in May. So what happens now? Well, it's safe to say Jerome Powell won't be serving another term at the Federal Reserve. Will this mean that he leaves the organization altogether? And what's more, there are some lawmakers, centrist senators, even in Trump's own Republican Party, who are somewhat alarmed by this norm-shattering attack on an institution that's supposed to be above the political fray to concentrate on directing monetary policy for the good of the economy. There has been some arguments here in the US over the past year or so about whether Trump could fire a sitting Federal Reserve chair. The Supreme Court has indicated that this can't really be done except for what's called cause. Essentially, that could include some kind of criminal investigation. So you can see where this is starting to go. The front runner for the Federal Reserve, Kevin Hassett, to replace Powell, he works for Trump at the White House. He's indicated he will cut interest rates, but could this all turn sour for someone like Kevin Hassett if he displeases Trump down the line? Trump is obviously facing lots of questions about this. The White House has said that he did not direct the Department of Justice to start this probe, but Trump is addressing policymakers in Detroit on Tuesday and will surely be facing many questions about this. Anand.
Okay, on briefly, one other big story that's been making news this weekend. There were more protests against actions by ICE, that's the Immigration and Customs Enforcement Agency, after a woman was killed in Minneapolis. What's the latest on that investigation?
Yeah, that's right, and I can tell you that just a little later this Monday, the state of Minneapolis has confirmed it is suing the Trump administration for what it's called unconstitutional and an illegal, what's described as surge of federal agents as part of that crackdown into the state of Minnesota, and specifically Minneapolis and the Twin Cities. Some 2,000 agents are due to be deployed there. This, of course, follows the fatal shooting of Renee Good, a 37-year-old mother of three who was involved in counter-protests. And, of course, that death was caught on video. It's really already inflamed a rapidly escalating polarization here in the US, with both sides, the Trump administration and protesters, banding around the term domestic terrorism to describe what's happening. There were more protests over the weekend. You can see images there, not just in Minneapolis, in big cities like Atlanta and New York as well. The White House continuing to push back and defend that ICE operation you mentioned, Arnold, on Monday, with the White House press secretary Caroline Leavitt using the term lunatic to describe Rennie Good, and saying those officers were justified in using what she describes as self-defense. Arnold.
Okay, thanks, Owen. That's Owen Fairclough reporting there. Now, to discuss the latest in U.S. politics, let's bring in our panel. From Maryland, Joseph Williams is a former senior editor at U.S. News and World Report. From Miami, we're joined by Jadan Horyn. He is a political analyst. John Fishwick Junior is a trial lawyer and former U.S. attorney for the Western District of Virginia. And from Austin, Texas, Kate Lincoln-Goldfinch is an immigration attorney. Welcome to all of you. Joseph, let me start with you. Let's start with the investigation into Federal Reserve Chairman Jerome Powell. You know, there's been something of a firewall between the Oval Office and the office of the Chairman of the Federal Reserve. Others have tried to breach it as well, but it's often regarded as a sacrosanct office. So what do you make of this latest action?
Well, it's hard to see this as anything other than retribution by President Trump. I mean, he kind of telegraphed his punch during that meeting when he was given a tour by Chair Powell of the new Fed Reserve offices. And he mentioned a couple of times that, you know, he thought that the costs were way higher than anticipated, and that he saw overruns. And that kind of telegraphed what he was going to do. Now, the reporting has been that Trump didn't directly tell the FBI to investigate Chairman Powell, but he kind of did in a couple of tweets after that meeting. And even if he didn't explicitly say for the FBI to go after Chair Powell, that he did say something along the lines where King Henry II said, will no one rid me of this meddlesome Fed chair? And I think that the FBI kind of took up the hint. The big question is, what are markets going to do about this? Are they going to be roiled? Are they going to be calm? There's kind of a minimal amount of panic here, which indicates that the markets don't believe this is going to go very far. But it's hard to say otherwise. And it's hard to say that even the fact that this is happening is not a red light, hair on fire emergency that some in Congress and even those outside of Congress might need to take some heed and try to get President Trump to not do this thing.
Jadan Horyn, what is your view? I mean, there are, as I pointed out, others who tried to go after the Federal Reserve Chairman. There was Richard Nixon for one, George H.W. Bush for another. In this instance, and as our reporter pointed out, the Chairman of the Federal Reserve can be prosecuted for cause. But do you believe in this case that reaches that threshold?
Well, I believe fundamentally many in the Republican camp have always viewed the independence of the Federal Reserve as a kind of an artifice of a previous way of viewing monetary policy, and many, as you mentioned, have challenged it. To that point, I believe that President Trump is eager for a challenge that goes to the Supreme Court in a ruling on this, to what under that constitutional and legal definition merits for cause. Certainly, waste, fraud, and abuse is something that Congress should take seriously. In the wake of what we saw going on in Minnesota, I think there is additional scrutiny of all individuals. And the other thing I will add, too, is, you know, the FBI has investigations into many people. And what I thought was extraordinary was that he revealed that he was the subject of an FBI investigation. And, you know, that doesn't necessarily mean that someone is guilty of anything. You know, what is being alleged from what I gather is that he either misappropriated funds or misrepresented and therefore perjured himself intentionally or unintentionally in front of Congress. But beyond that, this really is about the political power of the presidency and the independence of the Federal Reserve, and two very different beliefs of what that monetary policy ought to be, whether it's directed independently or directed by the president. And the ramifications are for any future president to either give them additional power or to forever circumscribe this power that many presidents have wanted.
John Fishwick, is this about waste, fraud, and abuse? Do you see a case here? What are the legal ramifications of what we're seeing?
Well, President Trump certainly makes it difficult, Anon, for his DOJ lawyers to do their job. With he targets these high-profile folks, and at least the public thinks he's targeted these high-profile folks, it has backfired for DOJ. Letitia James, a grand jury, refused to indict her, which is unheard of. In the Comey case, one of the indictments was refused by the grand jury. It's always been known that a grand jury will indict a ham sandwich, and that seems to be different. So when Trump says these things about folks, it makes it more difficult for his lawyers to do their job. Now, in the Comey and James case, there was certainly some meat on the bones of those prosecutions, but this seems to be a huge uphill climb for DOJ. After all, they're talking about testimony about costs for two buildings that are being renovated in Washington, D.C. and costs overrun. Just a newsflash, I gotta believe that every building in Washington, D.C. built by the federal government has costs overrun. And then, whatever his specific testimony, I think it'll be very difficult to say that he lied to Congress. There'll be tremendous ambiguity there. So I think it's going to be a huge uphill battle for DOJ against Chairman Powell. Ultimately, I don't think this case will be successful.
Judge Williams, I want to talk about the ICE crackdown in a moment, but still I have a question on this Powell case, and that is Jerome Powell is expected, I believe, to be stepping down from that position in May. President Trump could have waited until May for this, but do you think he's actually sending a message to the next chairman?
I think it's a twofold strategy here. I mean, he was obviously sending a message to the next chairperson that person needs to beware, or the full wrath of the federal government may come down upon his or her head. But I think Powell has the option of staying on as a governor. He will resign as chair, but he can still serve another year or so as a governor, and really bollocks things up for Donald Trump. If he does that, he can really kind of run interference and try to get monetary policy steered away from what the president wants him to. He can build coalitions and block some votes that Trump wants on monetary policy. I think ultimately this is really short-sighted. If it is what it looks like it is, it's kind of short-sighted by the president in that, the presidents are presidents. They're not economists. And that, I believe, is the sole job of the Fed, is to decide monetary policy based on economics, based on factors that deal with economic science, that deal with what they've seen in history as the economy. To take that power out of the hands of an independent board and put it in the hands of the president, I think is folly, and I think is asking for a recession after the midterms, which I'm not really sure President Trump wants to do that.
Okay, let's go to Kate and let's talk about the ICE crackdown. Kate, an ICE agent killed a woman in Minneapolis. Two other people were shot in a separate incident. They were injured, and that took place in Oregon. But getting back to the shooting and the killing of Renee Good in Minneapolis, this is how the Secretary for Homeland Security, Kristi Noem, characterized that killing. And this was in an interview with CNN. Let's listen.
If you look at what the definition of domestic terrorism is, it completely fits this situation on the ground. This individual, as you saw in the video that we released just 48 hours after this incident, showed that this officer was hit by her vehicle. She weaponized it.
So, Kate, what is your response to that?
That's really maddening to watch her doubling down on the lie. I've seen the video. I've seen the video from many angles. I know most of us have at this point. I think one of the things, other than the outright murder of Renee Nicole Good, is the way that Kristi Noem immediately, only minutes after, which she was many states away, came on and spoke to the American public as if she knew what had happened and told lies about the event. And it's very, very clear that this agent, who had his own sensitivities because of prior incident, was out there circling Renee's car. And if you watch the video closely, he moves his cell phone as he's on the passenger side from his right hand to his left hand so that he can draw his weapon. He puts himself in front of her vehicle, which is law enforcement 101. You do not do that as a police officer, put yourself in front of a vehicle. And then he shot her 3 times in the head and swore an expletive about her as her car was careening into a pole. It's very clear that this was a murder, and that is just as shocking as the response from the administration. One would expect that an administrative official would come on media after an event like that and say, this is a very unfortunate incident. We will launch an investigation. We don't know precisely what happened. There's video to review and investigation to be completed. And we're not going to lie to the American people about what happened. But that's not what they did. Kristi Noem lied to us. The president lied to us. And we all have eyes. We all can see the video. And I think that's one of the things that's going to come back in consequence to this administration is when they try to convince us about something that's so blatantly a lie. It's not going to go over, and it isn't going over well with the American public.
Now, Kate, there is an investigation underway, but when we see officials in this administration rush to the microphones after a killing like this and draw their own conclusions about it, effectively saying, look, we know what happened, case closed, doesn't that actually prejudice the investigation?
Absolutely, it prejudices the investigation, and we all see it for what it is. And I will also say that this is a very predictable consequence of the actions of ICE. We know that these cities, these localities like Minneapolis do not want ICE to come in, that there are protesters, and when they have difficulties hiring and they shorten the training timeline of these ICE agents and they put them out on the streets and they're untrained and they have guns and there are protesters present and these law enforcement officers do not understand or know how to escalate, this is what happens. And anybody with 2 brain cells saw this coming a mile away. And this was such an unfortunate and avoidable event. And unfortunately, the administration is doubling down when what we would expect them to do is at least express some regret. I haven't even heard, and maybe they have, I have not heard an official from the administration say this was an unfortunate event and we're sorry for her family and her 6-year-old child who probably right now as we speak is crying for his mom and wondering where she is.
Jadan, the White House has termed Renee Good a domestic terrorist. Here's Vice President J.D. Vance. Let's listen.
What I'm certain of is that she accelerated in a way where she ran into the guy. I don't know what was in her heart and what was in her head, but I know that she violated the law, and I know that officer was acting in self-defense.
All right, so Jadan, administration officials also say that she was using that vehicle as a weapon against the agent. Others, as we have heard, say that she posed no threat. What do you make of this case?
Well, I mean, unfortunately, it's not a case, right? She is dead.
Yeah.
That being said, though, what we do know is that sanctuary jurisdictions have put in place policies that have put their own citizens at risk. The federal government, as the Supreme Court has ruled time and again, has unilateral jurisdiction when it comes to immigration. Today, we see that no less than 2 states have now sued to stop DHS and its enforcement of immigration. But it was the Biden administration themselves that argued back when Texas was famously trying to enforce immigration law unilaterally, arguing the federal government was not, that they alone, the federal government alone, had the authority. And this is the natural conclusion when we have encouragement from elected officials telling them to disobey federal agents and to get in the way of officers who are duly sworn to protect the Constitution and uphold the law. I understand many people do not like immigration law in the United States, but the way to solve that is not to impede the federal enforcement of said immigration law. It is to lobby your legislators to change it and not to put yourself in physical danger in the way of federal agents looking to enforce and execute that law. Certainly, there are going to be agents who may have sensitivities to something that has happened before. I think we see that with police. We don't know, unfortunately, because she is dead, what her intent was. We can assume that her intent was to put herself or impede or slow down. Maybe she was just there to watch. But at the end of the day, unfortunately, she is dead, and we're doing some, Monday morning quarterbacking on both the intentions of the individual who is unfortunately deceased and also on the actions of the agents, in not talking about the fact that the jurisdictions themselves are ultimately responsible because they are not engaging with the federal government in a way that ensures that this immigration policy, which, by the way, was a large part of why Trump was elected because of the failures of the previous administration, to enforce. And that needs to be a part of this conversation, because if we don't get people to respect federal law, then we will have lawlessness, and we will definitely have additional deaths in the enforcement of immigration law.
Joseph Williams, what is your response to what Jadan said there? I mean, as Jadan pointed out, there is no case because Renee Good died. She was killed in this incident. But there is also the question of accountability, isn't there?
Well, yeah, I think what Jaden was saying was patently absurd on a couple of different levels. I mean, the first being that, yes, a woman has died because of an encounter with a police. Now, as a black man in America, I can tell you, I can probably tick off on the fingers of one hand off the top of my head the number of times this has happened to black people in America. So don't. It's a fallacy to assume that this is a random occurrence and that this woman placed herself in harm's way. We know from evidence and from past cases that's not how police behave in these sorts of situations. The second thing is that very clearly she was not the subject of immigration enforcement, and at very least should have been allowed to leave the scene. We don't know what's in her heart because she is dead, and to assume that she had ill intent by the administration and by your esteemed guest, I think is just ludicrous on a couple of levels and frankly insulting. And I think thirdly, the fact that this officer did place himself in harm's way, we've heard from many different experts that training 101 for police stops is to not walk in front of the vehicle. This woman was also given conflicted instructions. And if you're talking about sanctuary cities, cities are not standing in the way of ICE. They're just not cooperating with them. And ICE is not built to do what the president has asked them to do, right, which is conduct law enforcement operations in a major metropolitan area with virtually no training or understanding of who lives there and what goes on in those neighborhoods.
John Fishwick, what do you think should happen legally in this case? Because there's another factor that enters into it, and that this investigation is being carried out exclusively by federal officers. The local police on the ground, they're not involved.
Well, Nana, our country seems to be at a boiling point over this shooting that took place in Minneapolis. So I think it's critical that we have a fair, transparent investigation by the FBI. And time will tell if they do that. The legal question is whether this officer reasonably feared for his life at the time he fired those 3 bullets into that car and to hit Miss Good. So that's the legal question. They need to look at all the videos, interview all the witnesses. They need to interview the officer. And I do think what happened in that previous incident when he was dragged by another person when he was doing his job, that is, relevant to his conduct here. But it comes down to what he did and what he knew in those few seconds. Our country has a history of backing law enforcement in these situations. We don't want to second guess them, but I think we need a full, transparent investigation. There's a lot of pressure on the FBI and on Pam Bondi because they are saying they do not want to work with the state and local officials on this investigation. I think that's a mistake. Our country does best when state, local, and federal law enforcement works together on task forces. That makes law enforcement safer. It makes our community safer. So the FBI is under the gun here. This is a very tall task that they have, that people will have confidence in their investigation. And right now, you can tell from the panelist discussions on this, folks don't have confidence in that. And there's a real disagreement about what happened here. But we need a transparent investigation that people have confidence in. And time will tell if that happens.
Kate, President Trump campaigned on removing undocumented migrants. But if we look at how this immigration crackdown is being carried out, it seems that the legal process has been abandoned in many instances. I mean, we have cases where many people, in fact, there are thousands of people in the United States who applied for asylum. They are waiting for their cases to be adjudicated. They're waiting for the process to go through. Yet, if they are stopped by ICE, in many instances, they are arrested and also deported. And in many instances, people are being deported and not given access to lawyers. They are, by law, I would imagine, entitled to legal representation, aren't they?
They are entitled to access to attorneys, but rights are being violated and constitutional rights are being violated across the board. I am an immigration lawyer in Texas. I represent people who go to court hearings and they go to their ICE check-ins, and I can confirm it is absolutely true that people who are on the pathway to legal status. They are following the rules. They're doing everything right. They show up for their appointments and they are getting detained. I have a client named Carmen who was separated from her U.S. citizen husband and her 6 U.S. citizen daughters, was ultimately detained for 2 months and deported. I have Venezuelan clients who go to their ICE check-ins, a father, a mother, 2 young daughters, ages 4 and 10. This entire family followed the legal process and they were separated in detention. These 2 little girls were sent to one detention. Mom was sent somewhere else. Dad was sent somewhere else. The studies and the statistics show us the vast majority of people who are being detained and deported have no criminal history whatsoever. So what Trump told everyone he was going to do during his campaign is not the way that it's playing out. Our numbers are at the highest that they've ever been in ICE detention. We had more people die in ICE detention last year than we ever have before, and it is heartbreaking. It's absolutely heartbreaking. It's enraging and it's maddening. And that's why we see cities like Minneapolis respond to ICE coming in. The police forces in these cities, they want to have a good relationship with the community. They are all about public safety. They don't want to enforce ICE policies. And if ICE was behaving and they weren't going in and kidnapping people off the streets and committing human rights abuses, they wouldn't be experiencing the pushback that they are.
Right.
So ICE needs to behave and actually go after people who really are dangerous criminals, and that's not what's happening. And anybody who tells you otherwise is flat out lying.
Jadan, very quickly, I've only got a minute. There must be a political calculus to this. There are midterms coming up later this year. And if we look at the polls right now, President Trump is losing support among Latino voters. It was 41% when he assumed office, when he was sworn in. It's now 20%. He's also seen drops among African Americans and whites as well. Is this going to have a big impact on the midterms?
Probably not. The midterms are historically decided based on the popularity of the president. This president is more popular than his predecessors, but he won't defy political gravity. Likely Democrats will retake it based on economic issues. Immigration is something that President Trump was elected on, and we can expect that the American people are going to, by and large, support immigration policy that enforces federal immigration law.
Right.
With obviously some concerns and on how it is actually implemented.
That's it for this edition of The Heat. I'm your host, Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C. If you have comments or questions you want us to follow up on, please leave a comment in the app or email heatpodcast@cgtnamerica.com. And if you'd like to support the show, the best way is simply to share it with someone who might enjoy it.